Today's story from Matthew's Gospel tells of the field sown with good wheat, only to be polluted with weeds deliberately sown. Towards the end of the story comes the warning. All the evildoers will be thrown into the furnace of fire, and in that furnace there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I can well imagine that those of you watching on Zoom will at this point zoom for the mute button, and I guess that the Facebook posting won't attract many likes. But Paul's pressing on, because that passage from Matthew's Gospel is the passage appointed for this Sunday. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, not only in the furnace of fire, but also, I guess, in the offices of Gardener's World, at the suggestion that weeds be allowed to grow unhampered alongside a healthy crop. No doubt Alan Titchmarsh and Monty Don would succumb to an attack of apoplexy at the thought, and poor Percy Thrower, well, he'll be turning in his grave. This parable, unique to Matthew's Gospel, is something of a Cinderella, living in the shadow of the more familiar and less fearsome parable of the sower. That was the Gospel reading for last Sunday. You remember it. Sandy reflected upon it in last week's service. Seed falling on the path. Seed falling on rocky ground. Seed falling among thistles. And then other seed making its home in good soil. But here we have something quite different. For one thing, last week's parable was about seed, and all of that seed was good. This week, it's both about what grows from the seed, good and bad, and about the field in which it grows. And its overriding theme is that of judgment. In a sense, it's also about the sower, but that'll have to wait for another time. So let's begin by looking at the two kinds of seed that are sown. Year in, year out at Harvest Festival services we sing with great gusto, it's got to be said, "Come ye thankful people, come." It's a hymn more challenging than at first it appears. For it's about not one harvest, but two. Read the words carefully sometime. Wheat and weeds, tares, together sown, here for joy or sorrow grown. We know what wheat is, a nourishing crop used in the making of bread, the basic stuff of life. But what about the weeds, tares, bearded darnel? Well, bearded darnel is a pernicious and life-sapping interloper. Its appearance above ground is so similar to wheat that the two are often indistinguishable. Yet, underground, out of sight, its roots strangle the roots of neighbouring plants and take up all the nutrients from the soil. Only when it matures do its ears give the game away. Its seed heads cause hallucinations and even death. By their fruits shall you know them. Little wonder that, in the parable, the servants are eager to uproot the weeds in order that the wheat might flourish. But as we've discovered, identifying the good from the bad is not as easy as it sometimes is made out to be. This is where judgment comes in, and I suppose the issue of how and when that judgment is made. The wise householder errs on the side of caution and tells the servants to bide their time. He will, at harvest time, sort out the wheat from the weeds. So now to the field, where the wheat and the tares are together sown. Matthew suggests that Jesus said that the field represented the world. But what did he mean by that? Which world does that mean? If these really were the words spoken by Jesus, we need to identify those to whom he was speaking. The parable itself is addressed to a crowd on the beach. Jesus was teaching from a fishing boat. Then, the explanation of what the parable means is given to the select group of his followers. Both the crowd on the beach and the disciples were very much in and part of the world, the field. So Jesus was speaking both to the many and to the few, the curious and the committed. Now, just to make clear, when I use the word select to describe the disciples, I didn't mean to suggest that they were the best or most sophisticated. Far from it. They were certainly not, in that sense, select. Rather, they were once chosen and called, selected by Jesus to follow him. And like any group of folk, be it a crowd on a beach, a chosen few, or members of the churches in the Denbigh and Clayton West circuit, they were a real mixed bag. But what if these words weren't those of Jesus, recalled and recorded by an eyewitness, but rather, as some commentators suggest, those of a member of the church community in Antioch, some 50 or so years later? A church community with mixed cultures, mixed motives, and proclaiming mixed messages. Someone who is aware that within the community there's a lot of judgment going on. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who should be allowed in? And who should be chucked out? If ever there was a parable that speaks to our situation, with, for example, the conversations surrounding human sexuality and same-sex marriage, then surely this is it. And its message? In good time, God will sort it out. And again, the parable is a powerful reminder that those making up any community really are a mixed bag. And if that's true of communities, it's also true of individuals. Words of the childhood rhyme come to mind. Slugs and snails and puppy dogs' tails, that's what little boys are made of. And little girls, what are they made of? Why, sugar and spice and all things nice. The implication that, unlike little boys, who are all perfectly horrid, little girls are all sweetness and light. And who am I to argue? But if the truth were but known, few people, if any, be they little girls or little boys, grown women or grown men, are all good or all bad. Within each one of us is that which is nice and nasty, selfish and selfless, holy and unholy. Within each one of us can be found both wheat and tares. The parable speaks, as it were, of the field within each one of us. So let's go back to the parable. Why is it, do you think, that this story lives in the shadow of the parable of the sower? Well, maybe a clue can be found towards its end. The sting in the tail. It's that warning with which we began. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. On the day or days of judgment, how will we fare? I found little comfort in the rereading of Henry Cecil's book, Brothers-in-Law. In his story of everyday life in court, he tells of the man who was said to have been a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character, and who, standing in the dock to receive his sentence, heard the judge say, "Counsel has argued eloquently on your behalf that you are really two people, one very good and the other very bad. As to that, all I can say is that both of you must go to prison." Where does that leave us, who are a mixture of wheat and tares? Now, at this point, I need to signal to those on Zoom that it's safe to unmute. For someone once said that a weed is a plant whose virtues are yet to be discovered. So maybe there's hope for us yet. But better still is the assurance that God's justice is tempered with mercy, that whilst we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God's justice is tempered with mercy. The Hebrew word translated as justice is tzedek, and that means putting right that which is wrong. By grace, Jesus makes it possible for us to be put right with God. For those who follow in his way, any fear of a furnace of fire is banished by the promise of paradise, both here and in heaven. Amen.